Hei, tēnā tātou e hui nei I tēnei pō. Wai mari ana tātou I tā tātou kai kōrero mo te kaupapa nei, mo te aumangea. He wahine mātou, tino mātou ki tēnei tu āhuatanga o te tangata. Welcome along to our workshop this evening. Before we start, I just wanted to make sure you're all familiar with your Zoom and how to use the chat, because we're going to be using the chat on this. If you could just mute your mics while you're and pop your video on if you can. Sharon's keen for this to be a really interactive workshop, so please turn on your videos. Feel free to ask questions either by unmuting your mic or by popping questions in the chat area. If your name's not showing on your mata, I tēnā whakaingoa here, right click on your screen to name your screen so that Sharon knows who's here and who's talking. That will make it easier for any discussion. Feel free to use the reactions too if something resonates with you, thumbs up or a clap or something like that. By default, your view should be in speaker view, but if you want to change that, you've got the viewing options at the top right-hand corner of your screen. So set it to the view that suits you best. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, Sharon Armstrong. He tino ho nōku, he hōpū mau nōku a Sharon, nō reira e hoa nau mai.
Kia ora e hoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko whakapunaki te maunga, ko wairo te awa, ko taki temu te waka, ko Ngāti Kahanunu ki te wairo te iwi, ko Ruatani whā te marae, ko te whānau Hawkins ahau. Engari, I tipu aki ahau I raro e te maru o te tūpuna maunga a Taranaki. Taranaki maunga, Taranaki whenua, Taranaki tangata, e poi ana ahau, nā maioha ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora e hoa, thank you Hani Hai for that delightful introduction, and welcome to everybody who's on this. This is really new to me, and so hopefully I don't do anything major that sort of throws anything out. So as you're aware, I'm Sharon Armstrong. Currently I'm employed by Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services up here in the far north or in mid-north. I reside in the Hokianga looking out at the beautiful harbour, and I travel in daily to Kaikohe where our office is based. I'm currently the team leader for Mahuru Youth Services. It's a mentoring service working with tai tamariki from Ngāpuhi that either reside up here or whakapapa back up here that are between the ages of 10 and 17. So resilience is probably something that I'm seeing and experiencing most days. Unfortunately, it's not always in a positive way. So the kaupapa tonight is around resilience. Now, I just want to put a couple of things out there first. I'm not an expert. Yes, I have had a number of challenges throughout my lifetime, throughout my journey to date, some which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So my idea tonight really is to share some of those experiences with you, but to also talk around some of the strategies that worked for me. So before we really get into this, because I'm also hoping to leave 10 minutes at the end and someone will kindly interrupt me when we get close to that time so that I can allow an opportunity for people to ask me any questions that they may have. So, but before we get into it, I learned something new tonight, and that's about a chat storm. So can I ask you all to think about what word comes to mind when we talk about omangia or resilience? What's the first word that pops into your mind? Don't tell me yet, because apparently the chat storm is when I say go. So if you can all pop your words into the chat, the first word that comes to mind when you think of resilience. And then I'll count to toru. So kuariri koutou, tahi, rua, toru, timata. Throw it in. Okay. Wow. Now I'm not quite sure how I look at all of these. I put my glasses on. So we've got some fabulous ones. As you can see, you know, bounce, strength, aroha, survival, ururoatia. Ooh, might need a bit of whakamarama around that one. Brave, mana tangata, tūtono, kaha, mana aki, strength. Look, you're all on the button. Thank you for that. Perseverance, haere tonu, stretch. I love them. They're great kupu. And yes, they are all in that vein. So I'm now going to move into the next slide where I've pulled up, thank you, and thank you for please keep throwing them in. I'd love to go back after this presentation and go back and have a look. Tenacious, I'll talk about that one later because that's a favourite of mine. Actually, I'll talk about it very shortly. So on your screen now, you can see I just pulled a couple of definitions. So I wanted to get a Māori definition around omangia. And so this is out of the Māori dictionary. And so as you can see, it's those words that you've just thrown at me: be strong, brave, persistent, determined, forceful, plucky, resilient, resolute, steadfast, tenacious. Now, why tenacious? Because as a kid growing up, I remember teachers complaining when my parents would go along to parent-teacher nights about my tenacity, about that I was a tenacious child. It was said in a really derogatory way. Now that I'm an adult, I'm actually really proud of the word. So I just wanted to share that around tenacity or tenacious. The noun: advocate, campaigner, champion, promoter, proponent. I'm not going to read them all. I was excited when I read that because this was sort of part of my research. You know, you go through life and you have some experiences, but you don't necessarily do the research around what that may mean. So for me to see advocate, campaigner, champion, promoter actually gave me strength, gave me huge strength, because that's really the stage that I'm at in my life. I want to become more of an advocate and a campaigner. I'll talk about that a bit later on. And then underneath that, I also thought I better also throw in a Pākehā whakaaro behind resilience. So able to recover quickly after something unpleasant, such as a shock, injury, etc. Or the noun: the ability of people or things to recover quickly after something unpleasant, such as shock or injury, etc. So those are a couple of definitions and some explanations around it. If we can move on to slide 3. Now, I'm just going to leave that there because I'll just let you have a read of this, because I'm really this is where I want to bring in some of my experiences. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought back over my life and I thought, you know, there are definite periods in my life that I can remember that stand out as almost like a benchmark. And for me, that first benchmark was at age 22, my mother died suddenly. Now, I was 4 months hapu. I thought my world had ended. I loved my mother dearly. We were very, very close. And I'd just been with her the night before to get a phone call 5:30 the next morning to say she'd passed. That absolutely blew my world apart. The fact that I was pregnant with their first mokopuna and their excitement, and I knew my mother had waited. Every time I'd ring her, she'd say, you know, are you hapu, are you hapu, are you hapu? When it finally happens, then this happens. So it blew my world apart. However, I was hapu, so I needed, you know, people would kindly say to me, you've got to go, you know, you must carry on. You've got a baby to think of. I knew all of that. It didn't really help at that time, but I see now that certainly added to it. So that happened. 22, my world turned upside down. About 3 years later, my marriage broke up. That was also another point where I had to step up, become a single mother. One of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Then at 30, when I was 30, my father got sick. I nursed him for the last month of his life. And so suddenly here I found myself at 30, an orphan, so to speak, and a single parent of an 8-year-old child. So I didn't have time really to dwell on too much. So I just got on with life really to be, you know, I think with my mother dying, that became a benchmark. And throughout every other piece of challenging experience in my life, I have always gone back to that and thought, oh my God, if I can survive and move on and carry on with my life and laugh and live again without my mother on earth with me, then I can basically tackle anything. So other experiences with things like work challenges. I began work in the 70s. I faced sexism, throughout the 70s, the 80s, all of the derogatory stuff that went with that, equal pay. Throughout the 90s, it was racism. I was working within the Department of Corrections. It was institutional racism. It was coming at me left, right, and centre, and I was caught up in it. I wasn't blessed with a singing voice, but I was blessed with a voice. And so I've used that voice over the years to my detriment in many aspects, because I have stood up against things that others may just ride with. The reason I've done that is because I've found it intolerant. And actually, the older I get, the more intolerant I become, and the easier I'm finding it to challenge certain things. So I wasn't popular at those times because of those challenges. So I was isolated, I was ostracized. Those are some of the things that come when you go against the storm. Then I add into that some health challenges, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I will talk about the most recent one, which was about 3 years ago, where I was really on my way out of this realm. My whānau had been called. I was very, very ill. I'd been in a coma for 16 months. 16 months. My goodness, I wouldn't be here. I'd been in a coma for 16 days. Now, woke up to my whānau all around my bedside. They'd been told to expect the worst. But like the proverbial weed, I'm still here. So that gave me really another second chance at life, where I thought, look, if you can beat this, Sharon, there's bugger all that you can't beat now. So that's probably dug it in even more for me. But just going back a little bit before that to probably the aspect in my life that turned my whole whānau upside down as well, was in 2011, in April, at the age of 53, being arrested in an airport in Buenos Aires, Argentina, with 5 kilos of cocaine concealed in my suitcase. Now, I'm guessing most of you will know my story. It's pretty much out there. You can Google my name. My daughter told me after I'd been arrested that suddenly there were about 13 pages when you would Google my name, with all of the media stuff that came up at that time. So I know that you'll be able to find my story. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, except to say that in those very, very early days, when I didn't know what I was confronted with, I didn't know how I was going to tell my whānau and my friends. One of my friends, Hini, sitting here in this room, despite her giving me every single warning she could give me about keeping safe and not doing what I did it anyway. Why? That's another story, and not the kaupapa for today. The why is really around the grooming and the psychology behind what happens when people are romancing via a scam. But save that one for another day, because today is about resilience. So for me, those first couple of months in prison were scary, were all of the things that you could probably imagine that they would be. However, I can remember within the first week thinking things could have been worse. And I think that was the beginning of me coming back. Once I could put something in place and think, oh my God, things could have been worse. I could have been arrested in a country with the death penalty. And if that be the case, I probably wouldn't be here doing this evening. I could have made it to London and been responsible for putting 5 kilos of cocaine onto the streets, cut with goodness knows what. People could have died. I would have found that very difficult to live with. Or I could have turned up in London, they could have whipped me into a car, van, whatever, round the corner, slit my throat, taken all my ID and left me for dead. They're very real scenarios that happen from that sort of thing. So once I could do that, that was one of my strategies. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because I now want to, I'm just checking my notes, trying to keep myself focused. So if we can move on to the next slide, hopefully you've got a bit of an idea out of that last one around some of the psychology behind resilience. Now, I thought this one was important because it's a question that I've asked myself, and I'm dealing with as many of you probably are, with our tamariki and our tai tamariki, our rangatahi, our adults that are all dealing with trauma in one way or another, be it intergenerational trauma or trauma from a number of other avenues. So one would think that I would have thought initially that trauma would help make someone more resilient, but clearly, as you can see here, sometimes that's not the case. So, you know, often people can become highly resilient, but sometimes that may not be the case if they're suffering trauma. So I thought that was important to pick up on that point. Can resilience be taught? This always, you know, was a question I had asked myself numerous times. And yes, and I want to conclude with that. So I'm just going to park that up as well. Look at what my notes were around what I was supposed to be saying on this one. Are we on slide 4? Can I just check? A thumbs up? Yes. Yep, kapai. So for me, the other stuff I want to just cover in this slide was, why is it important? Why is resilience important? I need my glasses for this to look at my notes, sorry. Because it enables us to develop strategies we can use to protect us from these overwhelming experiences. It helps us to maintain balance in our lives during difficult or stressful times. Look, and this is so tika, because this is exactly the experience that I had, particularly in Argentina. And it can help and protect us from developing some mental health difficulties. You know, I watched women in prison that climbed into dark holes and never climbed out until the day they were released. You know, for me, I was never, ever going to allow that to happen. And some of my other whakaaro around this, and I am going to talk a little bit, if I have time, just on the strategies that I used, but just around some of my experience, some key things. You know, number one, does something belong to you? If something's happened to you, or someone said something, or you've been hurt, or something's happened, does it belong to you? Ask yourself that question. Secondly, own your own shit. You know, seriously, that is so important. Own what is yours, but don't take on board what isn't. And then the third one for me is forgiveness. Because seriously, one of my greatest learnings in Argentina was that forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's all about me. And that if I could forgive me, then I could move on with my life. I wouldn't become bitter and twisted, and that was really important. If we move to the last slide quickly, because I know I must be using up my time. So I've brought in the wharitapa whā. Why have I done that? Because this is exactly what I went back to. I went back to this model in my deepest days in those first few weeks, and I thought, my God, how am I going to find a way out of this? And I thought, my whānau. You know, I knew if I kept well, my whānau would stay well. I knew if my whānau was well, I'd be well. Vice versa. My whānau loved me unconditionally and stood beside me, as did many of my friends and my whānau. So that was a strategy that was very, very strong for me. Hininaro, controlling what I was thinking, controlling the thoughts that I had, not allowing myself to get too muki, not allowing myself to be sad or those sorts of things. You know, I'd argue with myself. I'd sometimes have a pity party. I'd let it last for 5 minutes, and then it would be a kick in the butt, get over myself, pick it up and move on. So, you know, you can control your thoughts. You can control them and ensure that you're thinking more positive thoughts. Tinana, I got fit. I looked after my body. It's the first time in my life I only had to worry about me. And so I got fit. I walked round and round and round and round the yard. 250 times I'd walk around the yard. Tinana, wairua. Every day I did my karakia. Every day, even though I don't know a lot. And I didn't know a lot of, I know more now. I didn't know many then. I would just say it in English if I needed to my mum, to my tupuna, to my dad, to those that I knew were all watching over me. That was my wairua. And my nāko, it was about really getting in tune with it, because, you know, like our puku, it has feelings, I believe. And, you know, so it was getting in touch with, is this right? Does it feel right for me? When I did my research around this topic of resilience, what did I come up with? 5 pillars. So from a park, so that's my perspective and some of my strategies. From a park hour perspective, they talk about self-awareness, mindfulness, self-care, positive relationships, and purpose. And for me, they're all wrapped up in our whare tapa whā model. That is what we are and what we do. Last slide. Sorry, I forgot I had one more. I must be using up my time now. And this is really a challenge to all of us. So as teachers, educators, matua, sorry, are we on the last slide, Te Aorangi? Yeah, cool. Why are some people more resilient than others? So for me, it says in here, according to this woman whom I don't know, but I really liked the quote, was the very earliest days of our lives and our closest relationships can offer clues about how we can cope with adversity. So as teachers, educators, matua, mentors, he aha rānei, we need to continue to build hope, dreams, belief in our tamariki, our tai tamariki, while they're young. Because if we do that and we build that hope and we help them have dreams and we help them to believe in themselves, then they're going to be a little bit better equipped when they have to be confronted with some aspect of adversity. Now, I hope I've left time for questions.
I think you have.
Yes.
Tēnā rā koe whaia Sharon, I rā kōrero mo tēnei mea te aumangia o te resilience. He tino hoki ngā mahara e rā kōrero. Ki te wā I whakawhiti reta, tāua I a koe I here ana I Argentina. Mena he pātai e hoa mā, whiua ki te chat I tēnei wā. He pātai tāku ki te timatanga. So I've just got a quick pātai here for you, whaia Sharon, around the different touch points in your life that you've talked about and the different events that have happened. Do you think that those touch points have helped you to build resilience?
Absolutely, I think they've helped me build resilience. And I think the way in which they've helped me build resilience is because I keep thinking if I got through that, then I can get through whatever it is I'm facing now. I remember vividly, the first time they put handcuffs on me, the first time they locked me in a cell, and thinking, oh my God, really, this was not on my life plan. But thinking, think back, you survived the death of your mother as a 22-year-old. There was no way I was going to let this be the end of it. So yes, I do believe that, I think what it does is I get over stuff faster. So, I'm developing an ability to almost remove myself from a situation and be able to look as an outsider. And I think that's some of the stuff that's come because of my experiences, that I bounce back a lot faster. Someone used that word earlier.
Kia ora, Sharon. We've had a question come through around tolerance and whether that was part of your resilience strategy.
Oh, I love that.
Tolerance, yeah.
I guess so. Tolerance and patience, really, because, especially, and I think, it's funny, in this COVID time, I find myself and watching people in a similar position to what I was in when I was locked up in Argentina. We don't know what's around the corner. We don't know when it's going to end. I didn't know when I was going to get out of prison. So tolerance, patience, all of those things, I think they're just a necessary part of it. I'm not sure whether it was a conscious part of my strategy, but sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. You were very tolerant. I mean, you had no choice because you didn't understand the language that was being spoken around you. All those whole cultural difference. There was many things that you were forced to be tolerant about. So many things, I know. There was another question that came through that I saw around whether or not you think you have to go through trauma to build resilience.
Trauma is a really strong word. So like some of those racist and sexist comments and stuff that I believe did help build resilience in me, didn't, or maybe a couple of them might have created some trauma, but I don't consider them to be traumatic. You know, for me, the trauma is at the high end of the scale. It probably is, you know, my mother dying, those things at that traumatic end. But I think resilience can still come just by the fact that, you know, anything, you can come up against not getting a job, you know, applying for a job you want. You know, if you don't get that, that's going to add to it. You know, you're going to learn, you know, failure is good for us. You know, it's not until you get to, you know, my end of the spectrum that we really start to understand the truth behind that. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure if that's answered the question, but.
There's another question that's been asked around the forgiveness, about how you said you needed to forgive yourself.
Yep.
And people can struggle with that. And somebody's asked if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, its place within resilience. How does forgiveness fit within the resilience?
For me, I think if I hadn't have forgiven myself, I don't think I'd have moved on. And if I hadn't have moved on, then I wouldn't have bounced back and it wouldn't have been resilient. So for me, they are part and parcel. So if you want to bounce back from something or to get over something, or, you know, without going into detail, I've recently had an experience where I've actually had to forgive someone for the harm that they tried to cause me, because I don't want to sit in the hara. And I want to move on from it. So for me, resilience is also about being able to move on from something. And so for me to be able to do that, it meant I needed to forgive, to let it go. Others may have a different experience.
We're muted.
Any other last questions? Have I missed any that anybody wanted to ask?
I agree. Good to forgive, but you don't have to forget.
Yes.
Never forget. You'll never forget. Yeah.
That's
just one last part, do you think you don't know how strong you are until you are faced with adversity?
Totally. That probably totally sums it up. I've had so many people since I've come home that have said to me, "Oh, fire," or "Shaz," or, you know, whatever they've called me. I couldn't have done what you did. Well, I'd call BS on that, because seriously, you don't know. You don't know what you're capable of. If someone had said to me, "You're going to be locked up in a prison for 2.5 years and not see your whānau, not see your mokopuna for 2.5 years, you're going to be accused of being a drug mule," hell, I would have also said, hell no, I couldn't survive that, but I did. So that is one of my favourite sayings, you know, and it's true. And actually, just to sort of sum it up, I guess, cliches, don't underestimate them, because actually a lot of those cliches are what also got me through, you know, forgiveness. Nelson Mandela, forgiveness liberates the soul. You know, we may not have it all together, but together we can have it all. You know, all of those various things. You can choose to be happy or sad. Why would you choose to be sad? Those are all things that are good messages that you can give yourself.
Ka pai, that's an awesome thing to end on. Ngā mihi nui kia koe e hoa. I can see that people have resonated with so many things that you've said. If you want to look through the chat quickly, you can see how people have, you know, having gone through some of those times with you, I can tell you that there would be no better speaker to talk about this kaupapa than Sharon, which is why we invited her too. And it's such a big kaupapa for kids and for kura in schools these days, you know. And when we were children, resilience wasn't a value because we were kind of resilient. These days, most kura, most schools have resilience as a value or somewhere in their charter about trying to grow resilient kids. So it's a big kaupapa for kaiako and for kura. So thank you so much for agreeing to join us here this evening. Ngā mihi nui kare mutu ngā mihi kia koe. Kia tātou anō hoki. You might want to take an opportunity to read Sharon's book. It's a truly inspirational read. Organised Deception, My Story. It makes for a compelling read. Check it out. Coming up on the main stage at 8 p.m. We've got our final keynote, Henu Rewa Poutu. Some of you will know Henu Rewa, followed by our karakia for the day. But before that, you might have time to join one last 10-minute quick workshop. And don't forget to grab the passcode for the event game as you leave the room. Hei kona mai.
Ka kite.